Bloody hell, I'm starving.
Those dreary words often echoed around the camp of desperate, bloodied souls. Some spoken aloud, others only passed in pained whispers, or simply purveying the entire atmosphere in the Valley Forge encampment. Morale was incredibly low, lower than the temperature. The flashing steel and the blood-red uniforms of the British Army were as far from everyone's mind as the ragged band of patriots languished in the cold. The biggest danger to the Continental Army did not come from without, but from within. No enlisted man, officer, nor volunteer did not know hunger. Without proper supplies, they'd taken to eating anything from roots and tree bark to cotton or sawdust, just to fill the howling voids that were their shrunken guts. What Solomon, or Sully, as his comrades called him, did not like was that the words came from Arthur, his closest friend. They were dragging a wrapped, stiff corpse of a perished fellow patriot through the surrounding forest. The look in his eyes as he sized up the body gave Sully a strange feeling in his stomach. He could not fault Arthur that much. They wore ragged uniforms, or at least what passed for uniforms in this outfit, none of which did much to prevent the cold from seeping into their very bones. They carried muskets over their shoulders, which they'd fired in anger at the English, and both of them had killed men before. Yet, just like many of the boys in this so-called army, they could not call themselves true hardened soldiers. Even those true soldiers that remained were in the same boat as the rest. Officer or low ranking, the hunger, misery, and the cold were truly equalizers.
What's wrong, Sully?
The boy tried biting his tongue. Arthur was younger than him, not by much, but he acted even younger. He was a rash and flighty youth. Sully made sure to stick to his friend like honey to keep him out of trouble. But like Arthur's hunger made him impulsive and morbid, Sully's made him incredibly irritable and quick to anger. And this time, he gave in to the rage.
Must you always say that whenever you look at a corpse?
He barked harshly.
God damn it, Arthur. These are people.
Sully dropped the feet of the body, causing his friend to stumble under the weight as he stood to take his full height.
Christ. If you so much as think of that sort of thing again.
I'm not.
Arthur protested, the look of hunger replaced with one of shame. He nervously rubbed his hands on his threadbare sleeves, trying to warm his stiff, achingly cold fingers as best he could.
I've been hearing things in the camp. They's keeping Washington's horse under armed guard. Wonder what they're getting paid to keep their chops off that thing. I bet it'd feed a dozen men for a week. I'm long tired of boiled bark and moss.
Sully folded his arms tightly to his chest, hugging what was left of his already thin blue and red trim jacket to his pronounced ribs. Like Arthur, he'd forgotten the feeling of a full belly, forced to subsist on little more than a few scarce roots that they dug from the winter-hardened soil.
Can't enjoy the meat when you've got a noose around your neck with a bullet in your liver. Don't make me teach you what becomes of those who give in and eat human flesh.
Arthur suddenly froze in place, turning only his eyes to lock onto those of his older friend. A pale look had entered the boy's rosy, frost-nipped cheeks.
Please spare me, Sully. You know I hate those kind of stories.
And so he did. Arthur was, in many ways, a fearless lad, never scared of his fellow man. He was a fierce fighter in battle for his smaller size, reminding one of a scrappy wildcat. However, Sully knew he was terrified of the old wives' tales of what stalked in the dark. More than once growing up, Arthur had slept with a lit lantern or curled up by the fire after his father or his brothers had teased him with stories. The story of the Scottish banshee from their ancestral homeland gave the boy a particular fright in his youth. So much as hearing a female yell in the distance could set him off. Sully was not so cruel as Arthur's family and friends, so he kept those tales to himself. However, just because he did not speak them aloud did not mean that he was lacking a few yarns of his own to spin on some nights around a fire with the men. Many of the natives who he'd made contact with, such as the Lenape, had their own ghost stories tied to the land itself. These were just tales, however, stories to scare children or fools like Arthur. But Sully was no fool. He was certainly no longer a child. He knew that man only had itself to fear. After a moment, the two picked up their ends of the corpse again. They'd nearly forgotten about it, standing quietly and awkward in the cold as the snowfall became thicker around them. They did not speak now. Arthur was ashamed of himself, and Sully simply having no more to say. At least, having starved to death, this body was not very heavy. It was all they could muster the strength to shuffle about their job at little more than a snail's pace. Their hunger and the cold had cost them both a great deal of sleep. There was no proper burial place near the camp. Sickness was already ravaging the army, and the last thing anyone wanted was to bury the dead too close by. A few soldiers, who had simply withered away from hunger, were elected to be buried deep in the woods, in a small clearing Arthur had found while on patrol. By now, even in the now surprisingly thick snowfall, the two knew their way by heart, and by now the corpse seemed to be growing heavier. It had become easier to let down one's guard in the banal, dismal conditions. In these close quarters, the only thing more familiar than one's fellow soldiers and their grumbling stomachs was the daily monotony of waking up, starving, and trying to sleep. The woods around the camp had long since been harvested to the bone. The animals were virtually gone, and any roots, berries, or even carrion had been inevitably devoured. Vigilant Patriot scouts made sure that no one, not even the stealthiest natives, could penetrate the defenses. A shame, Sully thought to himself, because he would have traded his month's ammunition ration, perhaps even his musket, with a Lenape warrior for a scrawny rabbit or a couple of squirrels. And that's why, when Sully looked past Arthur's shoulder into the clearing, he stopped, dead in his tracks. Just ahead in the pale gloom of the falling snow was a small pile of frozen corpses. The two boys had been working much of the day to prepare them for burial. They'd been wrapped in white linen, which was rapidly blending with the forest floor as snow began to dust the rotting leaves and dirt. This made it stand out even more. Leaning over the pile of bodies was a tall figure, completely hidden under a long, cream-coloured coat with a black tri-corner hat atop their head. The coat had been well made, yet was incredibly worn and tattered, covered in dark stains, and the green colour and cuffs all but faded to a washed-out drab. Sully knew that regimental colour was part of no army he knew or had ever faced. Still, he could swear that he'd seen that green and cream-coloured sort of coat somewhere before. The figure seemed to be rummaging through one of the cadavers, having discarded its burial sheet off to the side. What immediately alarmed Sully was that this man was set to be buried without any clothing or possessions, for uniforms were preserved to be given to other recruits that needed them. So, this meant the newcomer was, in fact, not merely interested in pickpocketing the dead. It was clear that this person was interested in the only earthly possession this lost soul had to offer. This revelation sickened Scully to his stomach, and rage began to boil in his blood. Dropping his end of the burden, he swung his musket off his shoulder, raised it to his shoulder, and levelled it in the stranger's direction.
Just what do you think you're doing, friend?
His deep, harsh voice rang across the clearing with an unmistakable echo. The stranger stopped whatever it was doing and was frozen in place.
What are you playing at, Sully?
Arthur, his back still to the scene, glared at Sully in confusion. With a speed that neither of the boys had ever witnessed in a living creature, the figure whipped around to meet them. Sully's weapon began to shake when he noticed the figure had not turned, but rather only its head had somehow twisted around to look him in the face. This had not been an arcing twist or the craning of the neck, reminding Sully of one of the wooden neck hinges from one of his father's puppets. However, this action did not sicken him nearly so much as the face of the figure. If it had once been human, that had clearly long been abandoned or stripped away. The shape of its head clearly matched a human skull, but the skull was almost the sum total of what remained. Whatever flesh that remained hung in thin, desiccated, tattered strands. Bits of it even hung loose like drying lichen. The teeth were jagged, brown, broken with bits of flesh stuck between them, and the lower jaw was smeared with cold, thick, dark, congealed blood. The eye sockets looked like they'd been long empty, the sightless eyes having perhaps been stolen by carrion birds. In their place, the sockets poured forth a thin trail of what looked like white smoke or mist. The two stood and stared at each other. If what the figure was doing could even be called staring, for what felt like hours. It did not so much as waver or shift position from where it silently considered these two intruders upon its gruesome meal. Even Arthur did not so much as budge, fixated on the absence of colour in his friend's face.
Arthur,
Sully spoke quietly, not sure if he was trying not to be heard by the creature, or to mask the quiver in his voice.
when I give the word, throw yourself to the ground.
What the hell is it, Sully? What the devil's behind me?
Damn it all, just do as you're told. Now!
Everything seemed to happen slowly in Sully's eyes. Arthur began falling to his right-hand side. His finger, rigid with frostbites, curled tighter around the trigger of his brown bess. A cloud, like gun smoke, slowly curled from his lips as he let out a breath to steady his aim. Arthur's foot lifted some of the rotting leaves from the forest floor into the air. He could see the hammer of the flintlock begin to plunge towards the priming pin. Sparks from the flint drifted into the air like leaves in a breeze. The priming powder slowly began to spark, and then blaze brightly. Sully could swear he saw everything happen at once at that moment. And yet, in the midst of all this movement, not once did he see the figure even twitch. It stayed motionless as a stone. The musket thundered and bucked backward, filling the area with smoke and shattering the deathly silence like a hammer to a crystal glass. Solomon had positioned himself well to handle the recoil, but he did not even notice the weapon's substantial kick. He stood with bated breath, Arthur having twisted to look behind him from where he lay on the forest floor. They stared into the cloud, neither of them sure what to expect. It finally settled and cleared, revealing the figure to be sitting exactly where it had been before. Sully was at a loss for words. He was certain he'd hit it full square, right beneath the left shoulder blade. And that's when Arthur raised a trembling finger towards the stranger, pointing to the back of its coat.
Mother of Christ. Sully, look.
Sully's aim had been true, striking the stranger right where his heart should have been, producing a clear hole. However, no blood was coming from the wound at all. This was an injury that should have been spraying that vital fluid across the forest floor, or spreading in a crimson stain upon the coat. Instead, all the two could see was a black, seemingly bottomless hole, from which drifted a wisp of that strange pale smoke. The creature, for it was already clear this was inhuman, was entirely unperturbed.
By God, what are you?
Was all Solomon could bring himself to say. With the hushed utterance of these words, the thing leaped into action, moving like a mere blur. Sully's gut instinct kicked in. Dropping his now useless musket, he threw himself on top of Arthur in a gallant, brotherly action. Draping his larger frame over that of the boy, he braced for the clasp of a cold, dead hand around his neck. Yet, it did not come. When Sully dared to crane his neck and see, the figure had instead taken the corpse by the ankles with its rotting hands. Quickly lugging it out of the clearing, it had already reached the tree line. The corpse had taken 2 boys to carry, yet this monster moved with the strength of 3 large, well-fed men at once. In its hurry to leave, the corner of his great coat had snagged on a protruding root. However, seemingly not noticing, or just ignoring the inconvenience, it merely continued along, and the coat was discarded on the ground. This gave Sully a full view of the horror he had just encountered before it disappeared with its grisly prize forever. It had a human shape, walking on a pair of legs with 2 arms, but it more closely resembled a bedraggled scarecrow. Almost all of its skin and muscle were absent, as if this were a corpse picked clean by vultures, yet miraculously continued to walk afterward. It was almost pathetic to look upon, as if a stiff wind could carry it away. The few shriveled tendons that were left seemed barely sufficient to hold the bones together, never mind provide it with the unearthly strength, speed, and grace with which it moved. There was undoubtedly something incredibly dark and unholy that drove this wretch past the point of death, if it had ever been alive in the first place. All the 2 boys could do was stare at each other in absolute shock of what they had just witnessed. They were uncertain about what they'd actually seen. They were not sure of when the alerted Patriot sentries had come running to the scene of the gunshot, demanding to know what had happened. They were at a loss what they would say to their commanding officers back in the camp. But one thought was foremost on the 2 young men's minds. Their appetites and shriveled stomachs had been thoroughly vanquished from the forefront of their minds.
Hey there. Thank you so much for taking the time to drop by and listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me. I put a lot of time and effort into making these videos, so it's nice to know that there's someone out there listening. Do me a little favor, would you? Click that like button, leave a comment, and if you really feel like it, why not subscribe too? Okay, happy tales everyone. See you soon.